I'm Victor Mallet from the FT, and I'm on the board of the FCC. Stephen is Senior Economic Advisor at HSBC. And we've obviously come a long way since Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and predictions of the inevitable victory of liberalism and democracy. And now we're at the end of history, or as Stephen calls it, the return of history. Stephen is going to come up and say a few words, and then we'll ask him, myself and fellow board members will probably ask him a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor to you. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, and thank you to the FCC for inviting me here today. The title of the book is Grave New World, a typically upbeat story from me about how things look so wonderful and will look wonderful in the years ahead. And I started writing this book in 2015, and as you heard from Victor, the subtitle is The End of Globalization and the Return of History. When I started writing it, people said to me, my friends in London and so on, said, well, why are you writing about the end of globalization? That's never going to happen. And they thought and said, well, it might happen if there's a Brexit or a Trump victory, but they're not going to happen. So it's totally implausible that globalization could come to an end. So here we are a few months later, and it turns out that some of these things have happened, and I think there is now a growing sense of unease about particularly Western engagement with globalization. And I'd like to suggest that, in one sense, the West has fallen out of love with the idea that borders fall, that barriers dissolve, and that we become ever more connected. That what we've seen over the course of the last few years, in the West at least, is a return to the supposed safety, security, sanctity of the nation state. And this marks a remarkable departure from Western values and Western beliefs, starting, I suppose, at the end of the Second World War with the Bretton Woods institutions that were created or dreamt about in 1944, which effectively set the rules of the engagement for different countries around the world, and were tremendously successful in providing a backdrop for tremendous gains in living standards over many, many decades. If you go from the 1950s through to the 1980s and look at the transformation of living standards in the US and in parts of Europe, and notably, of course, in Japan, the results were simply stunning over that period, much better, in fact, than anything we'd seen in the first half of the 20th century, or indeed through much of the 19th century as well. And I thought, if I'm going to write this book, I had to come up with, in one sense, an arbitrary sense of when we reached peak enthusiasm for globalization. And I felt that the year in question probably was 1989, partly because of Francis Fukuyama's paper, The End of History, which famously came out in that year, and partly because, of course, 1989 was the year in which the Berlin Wall came down, and it marked the beginning of the end of Soviet-style communism. And if you go back to the Fukuyama paper, there were sort of three claims made within it that were powerfully believed, I think, by many people in the West, particularly, I would suggest, the neocons in the US in the years that followed. The first claim was that Western liberal democracy was clearly now the only game in town. It was bound to spread to the rest of the world in a kind of natural process of osmosis. The second claim was that free market capitalism had undoubtedly succeeded, and that there were no other alternative economic systems out there that could be in any way as successful as free market capitalism. And the third claim, which in one sense is the reverse of the first claim, was the idea that authoritarianism had failed and was clearly going to be in retreat in the years ahead. So it was a kind of triumphalist view, in one sense, of the West's success in not just converting its own economies to a much wealthier level of living standards, but also a sense this would now naturally spread through to the rest of the world. And I think what is striking about what's happened over the last 20 years or so is that these claims no longer look anything like as strong or as robust as seemed to be the case back in 1989. So the first issue, for the West at least, is the success of China. China is not a liberal democracy, but it's seen an economic transformation which in one sense is the envy of the world. And just put this into context, in 1980, Chinese living standards were the equivalent of those in the US in around about 1780, 1790s, just after American independence. By 2010, Chinese living standards had risen to the equivalent of the US in the 1930s. So in a very simple sense, a simple rule of thumb, China's been delivering every 10 years what it took the US every 50 years to achieve. We've never seen such an extraordinary reduction in poverty as we've seen in China over the last few decades. It's been a remarkable transformation. So that's the first challenge in one sense of the Fukuyama thesis, economic success, but not associated with a liberal democracy. The second big challenge is that even as the rest of the world actually continued to show decent economic growth, the spillovers into the West, which had been predicted back in 1989, didn't really materialize. The hope at that time was that, well, if the rest of the world grows quickly, this will improve all the trading opportunities for the West itself, and therefore the West will carry on growing quickly. There's no threat to the West associated with what's happening elsewhere in the world. And yet, particularly over the last 15 years, Western economic growth has really tailed off. It's nothing like as strong as it was in earlier decades. And in one sense, 1989, you could arguably say, was almost like the high point of Western economic growth. And since then, things have slowed down quite dramatically. And this has created big political problems at home. Political problems associated with the inability of politicians to deliver on the promises they had made, which in turn were based on extrapolation of earlier growth trends. So things like pensions, healthcare, education, and so on can't be met quite so easily as a consequence of these much lower growth rates. The third story that's been difficult in the West is that 60, 70 years ago, there was a sense that economic growth lifted all boats, that somehow growth would make sure that everyone's living standards were improved. And certainly the kind of American dream or the European dream of the 1950s and 1960s is very much consistent with this idea. But what's been striking, again, over the last 15, 20 years is the sense that not everyone in the West has benefited from the supposed benefits of globalization. It's all associated with different types of increase in inequality. In the US, it's a pretty standard story. It's the overall level of inequality that's gone up in terms of income earners. Well, I distinguish between the have-nots and the have-yots. That's the big story in the US itself. But elsewhere, there are also differences that have emerged which have become politically quite important. So in the case of the UK, for example, you haven't got the same overall increase in income inequality. What you do have is a significant increase in inequality between, say, Greater London on the one hand, which has done pretty well on average over the last few decades, and, say, Wales or the southwest of England or the north of England, which have done relatively poorly. And interestingly, when you look at the balance of votes in the Brexit referendum last year, you find that Greater London overwhelmingly voted in favour of remaining in the EU, and the rest of England and Wales voted overwhelmingly in favour of leaving the EU. So I think there's a connection between the inequality story and how political choice has come through. And as far as the Eurozone is concerned, within each individual country, things look okay. The problem actually is the relationship between different nation states. So you've got this extraordinary widening of income standards between, say, Germany and Italy. Back in 1999, Italy's living standards were 90% of those in Germany. They're now only 75% of those in Germany. So it's a pretty remarkable change that's occurred over a relatively short space of time. Now, of course, each of these needs an explanation. Why is it that we've got weak growth? Why is it that income inequality has risen? Why is it that China's been so successful? All these things require an explanation, and there's a variety of them out there. Certainly for the West, you could focus, for example, on the impact of technology in destroying white-collar jobs, leading to increasing use of computerization, robots, and so on. And that's led to people departing from the workforce in their existing jobs, having to compete for jobs which are lower paid, which of course has created a kind of downward pressure in terms of wages, nothing directly to do with globalization. You could point to differences in educational attainment. In this part of the world, look at the so-called PISA tests, looking at numeracy and literacy levels, East Asia scores incredibly highly. Look at the UK and the US, they've fallen back quite considerably over the last few decades. You might point to an absence of social mobility. The American dream of the 1950s and 1960s no longer works quite so well. If you're born in a difficult position financially, economically today, you're much less likely to make progress than might have been the case 60 or 70 years ago. All these things are factors. But these are factors that are difficult to fix. They're difficult to fix, take a long time to fix, and some of them you don't even want to fix. No one wants to be a politician like King Canute standing in front of the advances of technology and say, go back to where you belong, because that's not really how technology works. So we end up blaming something else. And what we've seen in the West, in one sense, is a rejection of the values that used to exist from the 50s onwards. And I'm thinking here in particular of the sense that with the end of empire and the emergence of lots of different nation states, what we saw in 1944 with Bretton Woods, which continued in the 1950s, was a sense that we needed a set of rules, a set of institutions, which would allow these nation states to engage with each other. I'm thinking here of the IMF, the World Bank, think about the Marshall Plan's impact on the creation of the OECD, even arguably the creation of the EU. Think about the rise of NATO. All these things are very important factors to connect countries, to spread values, to have economic engagement that becomes ever more effective. And I think what's happened over the last 15 years is that there's been a sense that somehow these institutions either are less effective than they were, or in some sense they're no longer fit for purpose. And one thing I would note here, which goes back to the global financial crisis, is that before the crisis there was an extraordinary increase in cross-border flows of capital, an extraordinary increase in the claims that one country could make upon another country as a consequence of this massive increase in capital flows around the world. And actually none of the institutions that were created post-war were really capable of coping with the dangers of this going wrong, going into reverse. So what we did instead in the years before the global financial crisis was say, well, actually institutions don't matter. What matters is the effectiveness of the market. And that was a perfectly reasonable argument until the market got it wrong. And in the process of getting it wrong, you then started to see a narrative of blame and counter-blame between different countries, which can be best, I think, exemplified by the relationship between, say, Germany and Greece. Is it Greece's fault that it ended up with a large current account deficit? Is it Greece's fault that it had to deliver massive austerity in the years that followed? Is it Greece's fault that it borrowed too much? Or is it instead Germany's fault for having lent to the Greeks on ridiculously generous terms in the first place? Is it Germany's fault for running a large current account surplus and not thinking about where the money was going and whether it was safe? Was it Germany's fault that as a consequence of running these large surpluses, it naturally created instability elsewhere in the world? And in the absence of an ability to answer those kinds of questions in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there's a sense that somehow either the global institutions are no longer working in the way that they were, or they're simply unable to work in the way that they once were. The consequence of this is that we have a new narrative beginning to emerge. It's a narrative, I would suggest, of them and us. A narrative that says that the problem we've got in the US, the problem we've got in Europe, is because of someone somewhere else in the world. So in the case of the Trump ideology, it's all about Mexico, China, it's about Islam, whatever it might be. It's a problem somewhere else rather than difficulties within the US itself. You could arguably say that as far as Brexit is concerned, it's partly a rerun of that narrative, saying, well, the problems that the UK has are partly based on difficulties it has associated with its membership of the European Union. And once you get into this kind of blame and counter-blame, you can see very quickly how globalization ends up being in trouble, because all of the institutions that mattered, all the institutions that were important in shaping the rules of the game, if they're no longer trusted and countries go back into the safety of the nation state, you immediately end up with big difficulties, which are almost a return to the conditions we saw in the interwar period or back in the 19th century. So all this sounds pretty grim and pretty gloomy, but also I think it represents a massive shift in both economic and political power, and also institutional power in the world. So in the book, I talk about, in a sense, that we're now seeing the end of what I describe as a post-Columbus story of globalization. What I mean by that is that in 1492, when Columbus set sail and discovered the Americas, there was a massive change in relative economic power. Up until that point, it had been centered really in parts of the Middle East, in parts of Asia. Europe itself was a slight backwater in many ways. There were bits of Europe that had done well, like Venice and so on, but the overall European story wasn't particularly effective at that stage. But as a consequence of the discovery of the Americas, you end up with a huge increase in trade in slaves, unfortunately, in silver, and spices and all these sorts of things. And the consequence is that suddenly economic power shifts dramatically to Europe, and it's stayed there really ever since. And the sort of history that we learn at school, at least I learned at school, is very much a European version of history. But I think now, with the West's souring love affair with globalization, it creates an opportunity for others to fill the vacuum that is subsequently created. The best example I can give here is of TPP. So Trans-Pacific Partnership, the US pulls out. Suddenly it leaves a vacuum in Asia. So what happens? Well, of course, some of the countries can try to recreate TPP without the involvement of the US, but that's less credible. So what you end up instead is the option for another country to create institutions that will help to govern the 21st century. And of course, that other country is China. And you end up with things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You end up with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You end up with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And when you add all these things together and you draw a map of the world, and you think about the old map of the world dominated by the Western institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or the EU or NATO, whatever, and you compare that map with a map that includes the ones I just described, RCEP and SEO and AIIB, and you think about who that map might be familiar to, then let me offer you this thought that if you're a time traveler from 1100 AD and you suddenly arrived in the modern era and you look at a map of the world and say, which one do you recognize? You'd point to the Chinese one. You'd point to the sense that actually the institutions that are being created now in China are representative in one sense of a return to the kinds of arrangements that used to exist before Columbus discovered the Americas. So really quite a dramatic shift from what we've seen in the past. Now, I haven't got much time left, I've run out of time. I want to finish with one observation, because some people will say, what you've said is all very well, it's all very interesting about ideas and institutions, but you haven't mentioned technology. And surely technology drives globalization forward at all times. And therefore, whatever happens in terms of institutions doesn't matter anymore, because the connections get stronger and stronger. So I wanted to finish with an extract from the book. And the good news here is that I didn't write this particular part, so it probably is quite readable. This is an extract which refers to some views from Davos. Davos, of course, is the ultimate in globalization. That mountain retreat is well known for its confidence in all things global. So this quote is about Davos. It's about the wonders of technology and how it makes globalization inevitable. So the words are as follows. It says, as technology brought nature increasingly under its control by creating new lines of communication and by triumphing over climatic conditions, it was also proving to be the most dependable means by which to bring nations closer together, furthering their knowledge of one another, paving the way for people-to-people exchanges, destroying prejudices, and leading at last to the universal brotherhood of nations. And you think that sounds fantastic. It's a classic sort of Davos type of statement. And it is a Davos statement, but actually it's a fictitious Davos statement because it comes from Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which of course was published in the 1920s, but it was set in 1913. And the views were those of a guy called Ludovico Settembrini, who was the Italian rational optimist of his day, who features within The Magic Mountain. And of course, his character is a joke because anyone who reads the book knows full well that in 1914 something really bad happened. My point is that technology, yes, it's a force for good at times, it's a force for integration, but it can also be a force for disintegration. And on that note, I'm going to finish my comments and then we'll take some questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. I have to say I'm rather impressed. You probably thought he was reading from that laptop there or had a secret teleprompter, but actually all that came right off the top of your head.
Probably untrue.
I'm going to start with one question, which is maybe sort of heading in a slightly more optimistic direction, but maybe you'll put me down and tell me I'm wrong. Have we not now, having had sort of peak democracy and peak liberalism in 1989, have we not recently, are we not approaching peak populism and peak authoritarianism? You know, after Trump's election, people are disillusioned with him. We've had the election of Macron in France, who's the quintessential globalizer, liberalizer, and he's got a stonkingly strong mandate in France, both presidential and legislative. The UK elections showed that the Remainers are having their revenge. That is, not everybody really favours Brexit. I mean, is there not a chance that we're simply seeing cycles of history going faster and faster, and that the globalizers will again have their day?
It's absolutely possible, and again, I would stress that my book was in its sort of formative stages before any of these things happened, so the book itself is really more historical than focusing specifically on current events, but obviously there are implied predictions about the future associated with these long-term trends. So a few observations. The first one is that I think I'm right in saying, may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you look at Trump's approval rating after about 130 days, it was probably better, remarkably enough, than Bill Clinton's was after 130 days. So it's not clear that he's completely damaged at this stage, although clearly there's some peculiarities going on. The second thing I would note is that Macron's come in under a wave of tremendous popular sentiment, not just in France, but in other parts of the world too. Primarily, I would say, from people who are globalizers and people who believe in the sanctity of the EU and so on. It reminds me a little bit of Obama's victory, another hugely popular thing, not just in the US, but elsewhere in the world. And yet, after 8 years of Obama, we end up with Trump. And I think that Macron actually does have some significant difficulties ahead. And one way of thinking about this is to consider what needs to happen in the Eurozone to make the Eurozone a more effective economy. And I would argue that to make it a more effective economy, you need to have not just a monetary union, but you need to have some kind of fiscal union. You need to have some kind of fiscal transfer arrangement, which is automatic, which ensures that those who are a little bit richer in Europe will find occasionally that their tax euros are recycled to those who are a little bit poorer, which is exactly what happens in the US, it's exactly what happens in the UK, it's what happens in individual European countries. And Macron's indicated he wants this. But the difficulty, of course, is how you persuade Germany that this is absolutely the right thing to do, because, of course, it's going to be mostly the Germans themselves who end up paying the higher tax euros to support people in other parts of Europe. So I'm not disputing the fact that Macron has won, and won in a thoroughly convincing fashion. I am disputing the possibility that he will easily be able to resolve the problems that exist within Europe itself. And as for the UK, I think, in my view, and I could be wrong about this, you're right in one sense that the Remainers have sort of come back, and many young people in particular voted in the UK election this time around who probably chose not to take part in the referendum last year. But the choice the UK is presented with is one version of Brexit, which is the Tory party version currently, which is really an anti-immigration version of Brexit. And another version of Brexit, which is the Corbyn Labour Party version, which is a kind of anti-capitalist Brexit. But both of them are Brexit. So actually, if you're a Remainer, you might wish that things are changing, but in an odd way, your voice has been silenced because the polarisation of British politics is such that the kind of the midway, the middle ground, or the third way, as perhaps Tony Blair would have called it, I think has kind of disappeared out of sight altogether.
Thanks. So here we are with what you called, I think, a growing sense of unease. What happens now? I mean, do you, and you've got the rise, as you say, of Asian powers, including China. Do you subscribe to this idea that that inevitably means conflict with the declining power of the United States, or what will happen as a result? I mean, what are people uneasy about, and what is really going to happen in concrete terms, do you think? I know it's hard to make predictions. But.
Well, I can say I'm an economist and therefore avoid answering these difficult questions, but I think I have to answer them given the contents of the book. So there's something I do worry about, and it's another literary thing, because of course this title is a play on Brave New World, which is a kind of utopian version of a nightmare, and the alternative, which is the dystopian version of a nightmare, is 1984. And in 1984, apart from all the story about Winston Smith and Big Brother, you've got in the backdrop, the background, these three warring imperial powers. Effectively, you've got Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. And if you were to change the names to the US, Russia, and China, it's not a million miles away from some of the tensions we might see building up in the 21st century. We know historically that the rise of an ascendant power relative to an existing power has often created significant tensions. I mention Russia because I think that Russia is in one sense trying to go back to its imperial glories of the 19th century. It economically has not been successful, but Putin, despite recent political upheavals in Russia, still appears to be immensely popular with the majority of Russian people. Its popularity is directly associated with Russia's foreign policy, which is something that perhaps doesn't keep the West very happy, but it's worked very well domestically. So I think these three areas are sources of potential rivalry. And I haven't mentioned Europe. And the reason for that is I think that Europe really does get caught between whether it thinks it's belonging still in a post-Columbus world or a pre-Columbus world. I'm not sure that anyone in Europe has thought specifically in those terms. But what I mean is that Europe can look to the West and say, this is where our liberal democratic values are embedded across the Atlantic. But you've got the US, maybe not quite so enthusiastic as it once was about that. It can look to the East and say, well, that's where the economic opportunities lie. We have to take advantage of that, which in one sense is why the UK, Germany, France signed up to AIIB so quickly, even as the Americans and the Japanese spurned the offer. And in fact, Europe's history is exactly that you look at parts of Europe and you realize that they are dependent on relations with the East rather than the West. I mean, Venice wouldn't be what it is without the spice trade and the fact that it created enormous wealth before really the discovery of the Americas. So I think that the US, Russia, China story is one that has the potential to be uneasy in the future. But as far as Europe is concerned, I think it is in this kind of almost schizophrenic situation of being unsure as to where its future actually lies. So for all the internal tensions within Europe, I think there's an external tension too.
So on that cheery note, I can see there are going to be lots of questions. So we ask, I think, pretty much about anything you want. Technology, trade, politics. He's obviously got views on all of them. And somebody had the mic, I think. Did you have, somebody wanted to ask a question there? Okay, a gentleman here then, yeah. And then over there, yeah.
Stephen, yeah. Thanks for painting.
Please just tell us who you are, yes.
Yeah, my name is Jia Qinghai. I'm a member of the club. And I'm a fund manager. So, Stephen, I think the picture you painted is very interesting. And I was just wondering whether, in fact, it reflects something else. Perhaps it reflects a crisis of the Western political system, in the sense that to outsiders like me, who are not from the West, sometimes it seems that the Western political system is no longer capable of producing strong and smart leaders. Instead, the system seems to have become a situation where politicians make unrealistic promises and make false arguments just to get the vote. It's a descent into populist politics of the worst kind. What is your comment on that?
Yeah. One thing I do think is relevant, I mentioned technology earlier on, but I wanted to just embellish the technology story a little bit. I think that social media has dramatically changed political dynamics in the West, but in a rather unexpected fashion. So if you're a kind of, as I describe as a kind of normal mainstream politician, and you're working your way through your party and trying to ascend through the ranks of your party to become the party leader, with social media, you're worried about the possibility you could be found out for some minor indiscretion, which actually damages your chances of success. So you end up becoming a really boring politician. You do nothing. If I can put it this way, if Winston Churchill was in the modern era with social media, he wouldn't have gone anywhere because everyone knows he's a drunk. That would have held him back, I'm assuming, because social media would have frowned upon it. But the problem then is that if the mainstream politicians become really dull, it makes it easier for someone to come along with a different version of the truth, perhaps, who can, in one sense, hijack the mainstream political parties and do something which is different. And there are lots of examples of this. They vary from Trump, who basically won the Republican nomination against the wishes of the majority of senior Republican leaders. It goes through to the Five-Star Movement in Italy, which is a kind of cyber-utopian movement in Italy, which has its roots actually in North America, but it's a very strange kind of political arrangement. It's associated probably with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, because the other candidates in the Labour Party in the UK at the time were these very risk-averse people who didn't have a particularly powerful story to sell, and he had something different to offer. But I think that this is, again, a rather peculiar thing, because when the internet first came through, people regarded it as a way of discovering the truth. And actually, social media, I think, has taken us away from the truth, because what happens with social media is that you're able basically to reinforce your existing beliefs. You can find someone else out there who already believes what you believe. And if you can find, say, 10,000 people on Facebook or Twitter who have the same view as you have, you think, I must be right. Actually, 10,000 in terms of the size of the population is nothing. So you can end up with all sorts of cranky beliefs, which you can reinforce by finding other people who share those beliefs, which it kind of creates a breakdown in the pursuit of truth, which is particularly relevant within this room today, in the Foreign Correspondence Club, that journalists are in the pursuit of truth. And in one sense, social media undermines the role of journalists and creates different versions of the truth, which I think are actually quite damaging to democracy. So I think that social media has played an important role in this.
And you can tweet that. I'd be delighted. Yes, gentlemen.
Andrew Wood from BBC. Quick question. What are the prospects for a global revival or a significant revival of communism?
Gosh, which particular type are you thinking of?
Well, any really.
I mean, you know, China ostensibly is a communist country, but I think is a million miles away from the Soviet system. I think the Soviet system itself is something which is actually very difficult to revive, because I think people know it just didn't deliver the goods. I think that other systems where they have existed are mostly in retreat. So I'm not sure it's quite so easy to deliver fully fledged communism. But I do think that we are moving to a world whereby people are looking for alternatives to what we describe as the kind of the liberal free market consensus. And a different version of this actually is consistent with the idea of the end of globalization, that basically countries withdraw into their more protectionist, isolationist stories, which is not so much the rise of communism, but rather the rise of nationalism, really. So if I had to say, where do we sit compared with the past, it's probably closer, I suspect, to the late 19th century than to the immediate aftermath of the First World War. And I do begin the book, actually, with a reference to Lincoln Steffens, who most of you probably don't know, because I certainly didn't know who he was, but he's famous for one reason alone. He was a muckraking journalist who was around in the US in the beginning of the 20th century. He became disillusioned with his muckraking efforts because nothing ever seemed to change in the US. It's full of corruption of one sort or another. So he headed in 1919 to Russia in the sort of fledgling Soviet Union. And he came back, and his famous quote was, "I've seen the future, and it works." And you can see how people were enamored with new ideas, new ways of arranging economic and political systems. And for a while, people simply sort of turned a blind eye to the big costs associated with Soviet-style communism. It was followed up with George Bernard Shaw at the beginning of the 1930s, famously going to Russia and coming back and saying, this is a marvelous workers' paradise, and so on. He didn't mention the gulags because he hadn't seen them, and ended up with an opinion which again proved to be inexact. So I think we are certainly in a position whereby there's questioning of the existing order. I don't think that communism is necessarily the answer, but I do think that nationalism is possibly encroaching more in the years ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel Cartland. I'd like to ask a question which is kind of perhaps the converse of the one that Mr. Jars just asked. You said at the beginning that it's kind of surprising for a lot of us that China, with its very authoritarian system, is becoming so dominant and apparently so successful. And a long time ago, I heard a presentation, a very convincing one, by a political scientist called Jürgen Domesch, who was a very avid Democrat pre-Fukuyama. And he had this thesis that it's quite more or less impossible for a country...
Shout louder.
Sorry.
Oh, hang on, there's another microphone.
Okay.
Here we go.
Thanks very much. Yeah. For a country or system that doesn't allow or permit free debate and democracy in the widest possible sense,
Yeah.
to make progress, to innovate in all fields, including science. And yet China seems to be offering a counter-example. So I wonder if you've got any comments or any explanation on that.
Yeah, I have got some thoughts on that. And I think, in my view, the West has a difficulty with causality. And to be fair to Fukuyama, his recent work is more consistent with what I'm about to say. So, if you go back to England in about 1800, 1820, and think about who had the vote. Hardly anyone had the vote. You had to be a landowner. No one else had the vote. There was no middle class. There were very few landowners, so effectively you didn't really have a democracy. I mean, everyone sort of talks about the Magna Carta and so on, but even by the 1800s, there was no vote. You had the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, again, happened without a fully fledged democracy. Through the great reform acts of the 19th century, you eventually end up with men having the vote, but still no women having the vote. And it's not until the 1920s, after the First World War, that women do get the vote. So you've been through effectively 120 years of rapid economic development without anything resembling the kind of democracy that we now value in the West. So in one sense, the economic development predates the democracy. And one reason for that is the rise of the middle class. You're going to say something in...
I'm just thinking about Protestantism, because that's another explanation why put on one side, the whole Max Weber theory about the importance of the Protestant ethic and the discovery of the natural world and so on.
Well, I think in one sense that was an attempt to say, a bit like Fukuyama in 1989, that we're the people with the right kinds of values, therefore our values will prevail. And my problem with that is that, first of all, it's not clear that it's only Protestantism that's been successful. I mean, if you went back far enough in history, again, I mentioned this in the book, if you were, say, living in southern Spain in 1200 AD, you would say that Christianity in general is utterly useless, and that the way in which the world's going to advance is through Islam, because Islam was the big story of globalization up until that point. So I sort of feel that the link between liberal democracy and economic development is not as clear-cut and monocausal as people often think. Another example, Switzerland, by 1900, one of the joint richest countries in the world alongside the UK. Switzerland gave votes to women in 1971. So again, the link between economic success and democracy is not as strong as people like to think it is. So we have values in the West, and we are rich in the West, so we like to think that the values and the richness are somehow combined, but actually when you look at the causal process, it's not entirely obvious. Now, it may be the case that as China develops and the middle class becomes bigger and bigger, there may be demands for more of a democratic result, but it may be that democracy is more what I describe as an East Asian democracy rather than a Western democracy. So, slightly different arrangements from what we've seen in the West.
Thank you. Thanks, Victor. Mark Michelson, IMA Asia. Just a quick comment, first of all, on approval ratings, because I sort of look at those things. Clinton, 24 years ago, was below Trump, although his disapproval ratings weren't nearly as high. But then he went up to over 50% within 2 months and pretty much stayed way above that for the rest of his term for some reason. We'll see.
This is why Trump is so optimistic. You see,
It may happen. It may happen. It may happen.
Yeah.
He was 65% when he left, strangely. Yeah. Anyway, but no, it wasn't. There's a journalist who's fairly well known, Tom Friedman, who wrote about the flat world.
Yes.
And made a lot of money from it a few years ago. And a lot of it was based on what you finished your talk with on the technology side and so on. What's your view of that concept now? Does it have validity? Is it being challenged now about what's happened since? So on.
So my book starts with the very simple observation that people who assume that technology is the drive behind globalization, I think, are wrong. I think they're wrong because globalization depends ultimately on ideas and institutions. It depends on what we as human beings choose to do with the technology. We can blow ourselves up with technology. We can advance through technology. And the presence of technology neither confirms nor denies that globalization itself advances. So again, going back in history, if you went back to 1200 AD, you would say that Islamic southern Spain was miles ahead in terms of technological achievements compared with what existed in northern Spain with the Christian kings. That doesn't explain why the whole thing went into reverse within the next 35 to 40 years. If you look at, say, the Western Roman Empire and its collapse, well, it was certainly the most technologically advanced thing at its time, but again, it still nevertheless collapsed through other difficulties that came through. You think about the Dark Ages in Europe that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. The technology was there, but it didn't necessarily secure continued economic advance. So my concern really is this, that technology certainly has enabled living standards to rise rapidly, notably in the West over the last 60 or 70 years. It's not the only factor, and moreover, I think there is evidence now that technology is having some really strange effects on Western labour markets. I mentioned this before to a certain degree, but if you take, and actually I think Tom Friedman would probably agree with this in one sense, if you take the impact of 0 hours contracts or the gig economy, these are direct consequences of technology. But this is technology that effectively is rewarding the owner of capital at the expense of the owner of labour, rather than technology that's delivering strong productivity gains. So it's technology, and it does create some winners, but it also creates some fissures within society. And I think it's fair to say that Trump was able to take advantage of this. I mean, his description of the forgotten men and women of America was directly a consequence of a sense that not everyone had won from this story. And again, the political narrative that has emerged is fundamentally different from the sort of narrative that you might associate with the sense that technology is an automatic process that you just can't get in the way of. You can't stop it from advancing, but you can stop the advance from necessarily continuing in globalization, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. Lady Daniel.
Hi, I'm Nina Xiang from China Money Network. Quite a number of prominent investors recently said that our financial system is way, way, way more levered than 2008, and we're headed for the financial disaster of the century. Do you agree?
Do you think in front of the Foreign Correspondents Club I'm going to say we're heading for the financial disaster of the century? I'm not going to say that.
Please do.
I know you'd love me to, but I know. Well, a few observations to make. The first is that I think banks themselves are in a healthier position than they were in 2007, 2008, partly as a consequence of the regulations that have been applied to banks in terms of higher levels of capital, lower levels of leverage than might have been the case back then. That's all to the good. On the other hand, there are other areas where I would say that there are potential inconsistencies that have arisen that make me feel uncomfortable. And one of those areas of inconsistency is the gap between what we might describe as a US equity market that's risen a very long way and the US economy that's grown at a very, very slow pace. And those two don't sit that comfortably with each other. You can certainly find some explanations for why it's happened, but there's always a danger of explaining away too much through these stories that may or may not prove to be true. And one possibility here is that as a consequence of zero rates, quantitative easing and so on, you've ended up precisely with what central bankers wanted, which was elevated asset prices. But they were also hoping for something else. They were hoping that the elevated asset prices would lead to companies raising funds through the capital markets to invest, and therefore would add to the productive capacity of economies. So effectively, you get faster growth, which would then narrow the gap between financial hope and economic reality. And the longer this recovery has gone on for, the more it seems that we have not got the faster growth that was part of the aim. So in that sense, I think there's a worrisome disconnect between equity market valuations and the economy, and that disconnect could close in one of two ways. I mean, either we see a very strong rebound in economic activity, or the equity market at some point has to correct. The other thing I would note is that this is a slightly separate issue, but one of the things that the Federal Reserve has repeatedly done over the last 30 or 40 years during economic downswings is to cut interest rates by a minimum of 5 percentage points every single time. Well, with interest rates where they are today, you just can't do that. So there are some issues about the kind of financial lifeboats that are available in circumstances where there might be a recession at some point in the future.
Thank you. You're not worried about the China debt mountain or China debt?
I worry about lots of things. But I think that on the China front, one thing I would note is that I think a lot of the analysis on China tends to focus on, I might describe as the demand side, how much demand there is in the economy, how much has been pumped up, how much debt there is, etc. And I think that China's story over the last 30 years is mostly really a supply-side story. It's about becoming more and more productive, using workers more effectively, getting better capital in from elsewhere in the world, learning by doing. And my sense is that there's a slight overemphasis on the debt side and an underemphasis on the supply-side capabilities of China in the years ahead. And that would help to reduce the risks associated with that kind of problem.
Thanks. We're beginning to run out of time. Is there anyone on the balcony who wants to poke their hand up? And if there is, make yourself known. And there's a lady right here behind the door. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Preeti Davra. I write for Mint, which is India's leading economics and business newspaper. I wanted to ask you your view on Narendra Modi's performance in the last 3 years. And what do you think would be India's contribution to this new world order that you're talking about? Because you've spoken about China, but I'd like to hear about India.
Well, first of all, if you measure progress by economic growth alone, India's done really well. There's no doubt that India's become an even more dynamic part of the world over the last 2 or 3 years than was the case previously. Whether that's a consequence of Modi or not, I don't know, but certainly that's something which has changed. There have been a few peculiarities along the way, notably the monetary reform, which, yeah, is interesting, I think is how I put it. But I think what is interesting about Belt and Road from a Chinese perspective is that, and also from an Indian perspective, is that when you look around the world and say, where are the parts of the world whereby engagement would bring the biggest mutual benefits? What is striking is that China and India, in terms of trade flows, capital flows, and so on, the relationship is still pretty thin. Now, part of it, of course, is historical reasons of disputed territories and conflict and so on. If that could be dealt with, and there can be more engagement economically between China and India, I think it's a potential and powerful win-win story. So India, a bit like Europe in one sense, has to try and work out how much engagement it wants with China, how much it wants to exist as a kind of independent state separate from China economically, and whether, as China's ambitions for Belt and Road expand, whether it leaves enough room for India itself to increase its connections with other parts of the world. But going back to my sort of pre-Columbus story, I mean, if you look at the trade flows back then, they were dominated by both China and India and Indonesia, and the connections were, you know, partly overland across Asia, but also throughout the Indian Ocean. You look at the maps of what was going on, you know, in 1000 AD, and you've got these amazing connections between Indonesia, India, and China, but also the east coast of Africa, you know, Mogadishu, Mombasa, and so on, all really important parts of a trading story. And that's something I think that could easily be rebuilt in the years ahead. So if there's an open policy, you could create these sort of what I call Southern Silk Roads, these connections that would benefit to both India and China.
Thank you. Yes, and I think 1,000 years ago, India was something like 27% of world GDP, and China was 23%, something like that. Yes, I think this will have to be the last question, I think. The gentleman here, yes.
Thank you, Stephen Warwick. I'll just ask you the question regarding China, particularly, and globalisation. This year, we have seen a dramatic clampdown on currency leaving China. That is only currently getting worse. Very little renminbi is coming out of the country. So my question is, do you see that consistent with Xi Jinping's strategy of Belt and Road and globalisation? And do you feel that this is only a short-term issue, or do you think this is a long-term issue?
Okay, so one issue here is that China has an enormous amount of domestic savings, which are, in one sense, trapped in China. And if you're someone who wants to diversify your portfolio of savings and you're given the freedom to do so, you're likely to end up doing that. And of course, one consequence is likely to be that renminbi leaves China and goes somewhere else. So that outflow could continue over quite a long period of time. If you're worried about the consequences of that continuing, the only thing you can really do is to come up with some capital restrictions, some limitations as to the volume of outflow that can take place. And in one sense, and this is perhaps more consistent with the IMF's current views than their previous views, you want to have some stability in terms of your balance of payments position. You want to have stability in terms of both inflows and outflows. So there's perhaps a willingness elsewhere in the world to countenance more control in China than might have been seen previously. The downside is that the more controls China has, the more difficult it becomes for the RMB to become a kind of international reserve currency. I do believe, though, that over the next few years, decades, more of the controls will be gradually removed. As those controls are removed, China's currency will become more international, and I think there'll be a demand elsewhere in the world for using RMB as an alternative to dollars, and I think it's going to be particularly associated not just with Belt and Road, but also with the idea of increasing trade and capital flows with China from other countries in decades to come. I mean, China's ranking in terms of its international currency status has already gone up a long way from where it was 10 years ago. It's been massive change. But it's still miles away from where the dollar currently is. That's partly because of capital controls. But if those are gradually removed, slowly over time, and possibly unpredictably over time, then I think that it's still consistent with the idea that China's currency becomes increasingly important internationally.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for being such an eloquent and informative speaker. And I should say that there are some of his new book on sale just at the door here. He may have time to sign a couple of them, although he allegedly has a meeting at 2:15 in Causeway Bay, which will be impossible if it's raining, but he may be able to sign a few. But thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And we have a little something for you. This evening.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for being such an eloquent and informative speaker. And I should say that there are some of his new book on sale just at the door here. He may have time to sign a couple of them, although he allegedly has a meeting at 2:15 in Causeway Bay, which will be impossible if it's raining, but he may be able to sign a few. But thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And we have a little something for you. This evening.
Thank you.